Welcome, everybody, to today's event, Why Politicians Matter. I will be your moderator today. My name is Jonathan Madison, and I'm a governance fellow here at the R Street Institute. I'm a historian by trade, and I specialize in the study of liberal democracy. And for R Street, I produce policy research on elections, democracy, and political incentives. The R Street Institute, for those of you who may not be familiar, exists to solve complex public policy challenges through free markets and limited effective government. The beauty of limited and effective government is that it safeguards individual liberty. When politicians use government as a means for personal aggrandizement or the enforcement of supposedly ideal forms of society, individuals suffer, society is strained, and authoritarianism advances. That brings us to today's event. We have here a panel of two leading experts in the field to elucidate this relationship between our politicians and the strength of our democracy. And so I hope and I am excited to hear what they have to say, as I think this is a particularly relevant topic for us right now. And I think that we have an excellent panel with us today. As I go ahead and introduce our esteemed guests, our R Street team is going to share a document with you. I see that they already have that will include full bios for our participants as well as some additional resources on today's topic. Feel free to check that out. One quick note, we did have scheduled as one of our panelists, Jeff Vanderslice, the Vice President of Government Relations here at R Street. Unfortunately, Jeff is feeling quite poorly today and he's not going to be able to make it, but we'll wish him a speedy recovery. But for our two excellent panelists that we do have, first we have Thomas Carruthers, who is the Director of Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Widely recognized as a leading authority on democratization and democracy, he has been at the forefront of a lot of recent debates surrounding particularly the causes and consequences of democratic backsliding as a result of his critically acclaimed work on these topics. And you can find his example of some of these debates in the Journal of Democracy in that resource document. For our second moderator, for our second panelist, I have a bit of a personal anecdote. In my experience, when you are working on your PhD dissertation, you at first settle on your idea and decide that you're a genius, and then you have the day that you find through your research that someone else has already written what you thought you were going to write, and they did it better than you could do it. And that was my experience with our second guest, Dr. Anibal Perez-Linan, who is a professor of political science and global affairs at the University of Notre Dame, where he also serves as the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. His research focuses on political institutions, the rule of law, and human rights in new democracies, with several highly regarded pieces of work examining the democracies of Latin America. Before we get into our discussions here, I would highlight that you have the option to participate as well, and we'd love to hear your questions. And you can submit a question through the Q&A button, not through the chat, but through the Q&A button that you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. And we will review some of those questions later as we try to broaden our discussion. To get us started today, though, I'd like to ask both of our panelists if they could in 3 minutes to summarize why you think it's important to focus on the role of politicians and political leaders in particular when analyzing democracy and democratic outcomes. And Thomas, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good to be with you. You know, those of us who study democracy for a living tend to often focus on institutions, on processes, on values, on traditions. Those are all really important for democracy. But underneath all of these are people, and in particular, leaders who drive these things, who put them together, who shape them, who take them apart, often on the basis of ideas. Ideas don't come from the ether, they come from individuals. Individuals put forward ideas, they embody them, they champion them, they shape them, they use them effectively as political tools. And so both politicians and ideas go hand in hand together, and we can't understand democracy's progress and retreat in the world without a very close focus on them. If we think of the United States, we don't, when we talk about the political era of the 1980s, we call them the Reagan years because President Reagan was fundamental in shaping the direction of American political life. If for some reason he hadn't entered the primaries and for that presidential contest, and John Anderson or Howard Baker or George H.W. Bush or one of the other contenders in those primaries had been elected, the 1980s would have been different. Or if we think about the 1990s, the Clinton years were very important in reshaping not just how the Democratic Party approached politics, but how America evolved in those years. So those aren't just shorthands. Those are actually surprisingly accurate ways for all of the progress of human beings across history in terms of institutionalizing ourselves as civilizations and political systems and so forth. Individuals are still fundamental. That's both good news and bad news in different ways, as I'm sure we'll talk about.
Thank you very much. Annabelle?
Jonathan, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here with Tom, especially. So, regarding your question, I think we all know at some level that politicians are important, and they are very important. They have power, they make decisions that affects the lives of millions of people. They can use the resources of the state and the law to strengthen or to undermine democratic norms. And so when we vote, when we talk to friends, at a very basic level, we always understand their relevance, right? As Tom was pointing out. But I think that as political scientists, as social scientists more generally, as Tom mentioned, I think we have a problem with this obvious principle because we are used to think in terms of institutional or structural explanations to account for democratic outcomes. And it is very hard to have like nice, clean empirical models once we acknowledge kind of the agency and especially the unpredictability of our politicians, right? And um, so it has been hard for political scientists to account for this. Now, in the Latin American context, which is as you mentioned, the area I tend to specialize in, uh, an area in which very powerful politicians historically have been historically less constrained by institutions and by constitutional rules. I think there has been an effort, a more conscious effort to account for this fact and to study this, right? And I think you can see this in two ways. One is to show that the presidents, particularly presidents' personalities, for instance, their willingness to take risks as a personality trait, shape their anti-democratic behaviors. And I think there is a new book by Ignacio Arana. It's called Presidential Personalities and Constitutional Power Graphs that just came out from Oxford University Press that shows this with very interesting historical data for US presidents and Latin American presidents going back to the mid 20th century. So personalities is one way in which clearly politicians' features affect politics, right? But the second idea, which is also very intuitive at some level, is to show that politicians' values matter. And in our book with Scott Mainwaring, Democracies and Dictatorships in Latin America, we showed that politicians' normative commitment to democracy is the most important variable that you can take into account to predict the stability of democracy in the region. So at many levels, politicians matter and they are crucial.
Thank you. And so I think both of you hit on quite a few interesting points there that I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into. And Annabelle, you mentioned agency and the agency of politicians. And of course, like you said, there's a lot of this focus on presidents and their personalities, and for good reason, obviously, because they are the ones who have a lot of say over the direction of the state and if, an authoritarian project emerges or doesn't. But I wanted to ask you, what are the key political behaviors or actions on the part of politicians that can strengthen or weaken democracy that you found in your research? And kind of bridging off of that, how do politicians who are not the president, who are not the leader, how do their behaviors matter? How do they factor into this equation of strengthening or weakening democracy? Annabelle, did you want to take that first?
Sure. So there, let me start by the end. So of course, we tend to focus on presidents or heads of government because they have a lot of control over resources, right? But if you think about politicians at all levels play a critical role, in part because they define the tone of public debate. And so they shape the way in which most of us think about politics and the topics of the day and how we discuss politics, how civil we are. So that's super important. And there are a very large number of factions that politicians can take at every level of power to help or hinder democracy. But at the end of the day, I think they tend to cluster, I would say, in two kind of basic types of actions and principles. The first principle, I think, and maybe the most important one for me, is about the basic maintenance of Republican life in how they act, right? And so I think that when if you are in power, you're always confronted with some kind of opposition, right? And when confronted with the opposition, politicians in power can typically say, okay, you represent a legitimate interest, but we got elected this time, we won the election, and so try the next time. I respect you, but try the next time, right? That's one way of responding. But then the other response that politicians often have is to say, you represent illegitimate interests. You don't really belong in here, and we are here to vanish you, right? That's our mission. And so that creates a completely different dynamic in terms of creating the foundation for the maintenance of Republican principles. The second principle I think that politicians engage is that sometimes they are committed to the extension of democracy and sometimes they are not, right? So politicians can say through their policy actions or through their discourse, we are here to expand rights and to make society more inclusive over time, right? To fight a series of battles that are important historically. Or they can say, we are here to protect the existing order and to prevent subversion of our principles. And that may have different implications for democracy as well.
Interesting. Tom?
You know what's interesting is elected leaders in many countries in the last 10 or 20 years have been dismantling democracy in various ways. Many of the voters who voted for those politicians, even though they're pretty aware of what they're doing, tend to see those leaders as saving democracy in their countries. And it's a big mistake to think that there's a group of voters who care about democracy and a group of voters who don't care about democracy. And thinking that is usually a kind of arrogance of one side or the other, which is pretty unproductive. It makes you realize that it's not always so clear what saving democracy or threatening democracy really means. But I would start with, I think maybe I'm just restating, but one of the things Annabelle was talking about, which is that democracy is a system. Basically, at root, it's a system of limiting power. Humans have struggled to limit authority over them for a very long time in history. And democracy is a big answer to that question, which is limiting power, not just through law, although the law is absolutely fundamental to that, but through a whole series of ways of pluralism, of having a legitimate opposition, having an independent media that can criticize you, having independent civil society that can advocate for things for or against what you're doing, having a business community that isn't controlled by the state, and so forth. And so when a politician comes in and fundamentally doesn't accept the idea of limits on their power, that to me is the definition of an anti-democratic politician. You can say, but I like their policy on this, they're saving the country from that threat or this threat. I say, well, they're not saving democracy if they don't recognize the legitimacy of limits on their power. Because to me, that's the essence. And so I think it's important to cut through debates over policy visions about what's the best America could be this way or that way, or El Salvador or Hungary or whatever the country happens to be, and instead say, is this politician fundamentally challenging established limits on their power of all types? Of course, that will include the judiciary, but that will also include the media, that will include civil society, that will include political opposition, and so forth. So that to me, Jonathan, is the fundamental way that politicians can threaten democracy.
So I hear in both of your answers like there's a lot on the relationship between like power and the opposition to power, like the holders currently of power in whatever way and the opposition to that. Or like you said, some maybe the informal or like non-political, like the media, civil society, these different things. And so I think in the United States, that has particularly taken on the form of polarization. Like polarization is the big key term, right, that people go to over and over again. Like the country's too polarized, and polarization is what's damaging democracy. Like you hear that theme over and over and over again. But like what I think is often missing from that discussion are a few things, which is first, even if we accept that like okay polarization is bad and it's causing all these problems like what is driving polarization, what causes polarization, what is the role in this case that politicians are playing in driving that, and I think this is important especially for the United States in this moment, is like is all forms of polarization necessarily bad, or is there a specific approach or a specific response to polarization that makes it bad for democracy? And so, yeah, Thomas, I think we'll go ahead and start with you if you don't mind.
Polarization is it's like an ocean of a topic. You can swim in that ocean for a long time and lose the shore, find the shore, and get caught in all kinds of cross currents and depths. And, there's murky waters. Polarization is a very, very difficult topic. Um, I mean, without trying to oversimplify it, I think it's useful to start by saying I've done some sort of global comparisons of polarization in different kinds of countries. I got interested about 6 or 7 years ago and ended up doing a book comparing polarization in 9 different countries because as an American living in a society and a political system that's obviously pretty polarized, I was sort of curious, is it when another country is polarized, is it basically the same thing or is it different? And I begin to see there are at least two kinds of polarization that are pretty different from each other, although they can be related and often are. One is, I would call it sort of elite polarization, where the contending political elites in a country start moving apart from each other in not having many common positions, having really very different perspectives on what needs to be done, and starting to not accept each other as legitimate, starting to see each other as an actual threat to the country and acting that way and so forth. So you can really have polarization at this elite level, which is almost its own dynamic in which politicians begin going after each other and pushing each other apart. We think about, don't mean to point the fingers, one can find a lot of polarizing figures in American political history on both sides of the political aisle. But Newt Gingrich in the early 1990s, he was pretty polarizing. He went at elite politics, very shrewd, tactically very capable politician. He went at it in a very divisive way, I would say, although one could argue that so Democrats are being divisive in their own ways. So there's that kind of polarization. You see that in some societies like, say, Bangladesh, where the political elite was very entrenched between two parties that were going back and forth. But then there's another level, which is more like societal, where what has happened in the country, because of its history and the way it's evolved, they're really like two different visions of what the country could be. And some people sort of see the country as, I want our country to be this. And some people think, no, I want our country to be that. First, in the Civil War in the United States, prior in the run up to the Civil War, you had two very different visions of America. And people couldn't agree on them. They went to war. And that isn't just an elite phenomenon. That's where you really have contending visions of the society. Think of Israel, for example, a democracy. Yet there's these days in the last 10 or 15 years, two different visions of Israel that have emerged among, at least among Jewish Israelis, which is one is a much more religious version, Orthodox version of a Jewish state, and the other is a much more secular and in some ways multicultural vision of Israel. And it turns out once you have those two visions starting to really root themselves in the society, they're going to get embodied in the political system because political leaders, entrepreneurs are going to channel those visions and say, I represent this, and the other side represents that. And if you believe in this vision, believe in me. And so that's a deeper kind of polarization and one that's very hard to overcome because what you need then is something that allows the people in that country to begin to feel like, no, we have a common vision of our country. Either that's gifted political leadership that defines such a vision and kind of pushes it down, or something happens in the society, maybe a war from the outside, where people feel like, hey, we're all in this together. We should join up here. The United States is very polarized in the 1930s. The New Deal was very polarizing in American politics. World War II solved that. And as we came out of World War II, that solution lasted for a while, but again, the polarization began to reemerge. And in the 1960s, two very different visions of America, kind of progressive change vision and a more conservative, I like things the way they are vision. So it's important that when you say we're polarized, to ask yourself, is this just an elite game that could be solved by elites being a bit more cooperative and more consensual, or is this something deeper?
That's interesting because I feel like it also kind of shifts the concept to the fact that like part of the role of politicians could be to like mitigate some of that like societal polarization, and they can try to do that, or they can fail to do that, or they can inflame it, right, for their own benefit. And so as opposed perhaps to politicians driving polarization, they might just be failing to put the fire out in a different way. And so I think that that's an interesting perspective. I also think it's interesting to reflect like, is it polarizations like, you could be polarized, for example, in disparate policy positions, or are we just completely different visions of the country itself? And so, yeah, I think we'll go from there. Annabelle, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that point you're raising is crucial. The conventional wisdom, I think, among many political scientists and people discussing politics often is that democracy is eroding, democracy is in decline because our society is polarized. And my sense is that it's usually the opposite, right? The anti-democratic behavior by government leaders, when you look at different countries, further divides the society and deepens polarization, right? And sometimes transforms, kind of pushes that kind of elite level polarization that Tom was describing into a deeper societal divide that is harder to address, as Tom was pointing out. So interestingly enough, Javier Corrales and Ricardo Salas Diaz just published an article in the journal Democratization a few months ago, in which they argue that executives engage in what they call intentional polarization. That is, presidents use extreme ideological rhetoric in, say, historically in countries like Venezuela, but also many others, right? And adopt extreme policies in ways that divide society further and advance the process of democratic erosion, right? Give them latitude as presidents to further the process of democratic erosion. And I've been doing some work with some of my students here at Notre Dame, and it is clear that when you analyze data, say the VDEM data, for example, polarization very often follows from democratic backsliding. It's not the other way around, right? And so I think that politicians, as you were pointing out, have a lot of responsibility and in activating polarization intentionally, but also have the ability in many cases of deactivating polarization when they take a civil stand.
It's interesting. Um, Kind of continuing on from there, given the importance that we've kind of laid out here of politicians in determining democratic outcomes, what does that mean in terms of the way we choose our candidates? That's a big topic that we've talked a lot about here at our street and about, and is big in terms of like the election reform community is like, are we choosing our candidates in the appropriate way? And does that matter in the terms of the types of politicians that we get? Or is it just societal and however you choose your candidates, like the societal cause matters more? And so, yeah, I was interested what you both would think of how candidates are derived, how much that matters, and how much the US system matters in determining the types of candidates we see right now.
Oh, if I could start on that, Jonathan. The United States has two very distinctive elements to how it chooses candidates, maybe three. The first, of course, is using primaries, something Americans take completely for granted. But then when you go to another country and you explain it to people, they've never heard of it before. It doesn't exist in most countries. Um, Obviously, this was done, as a reform to make our politics more democratic, to open up the process and allow people, freedom to choose their candidates. But when you combine that with the second feature of American politics, two other features, in fact, very low voter turnout. Americans don't vote very much compared to people in most democracies. Because they don't vote very much, and you have primaries, it means that relatively small numbers of voters can have quite an outsized impact. Because if everybody voted, it wouldn't matter so much. But given that often in primaries, fewer than 50% of people are voting, if you've got a 20% block, very influential. Then you add a third element that's quite distinctive to the United States, which is the complete openness to political financing by wealthy individuals, or individuals, but the most weighty are, of course, the very wealthy ones. And the very wealthy, the billionaires who engage a lot in political financing on either side, tend to be highly motivated ideologically. Otherwise, they'd spend their money on something else. So you put those three things together: primaries, low voter turnout, high injection of ideological money, you have a recipe for pushing politicians to the sides. And of course, that's what we've seen in this country over the last 20 or 30 years. And given that we have a two-party system because of our electoral system, we're kind of locked into having two major parties. There's a centrifugal tendency in our politics, which we didn't anticipate. We always have this old idea of, politicians will naturally try to capture the center, but obviously what we've seen in the last 20 years is a different strategy of politicians mobilizing their base and not going after the center. So it's always important to see the American system in comparative perspective to realize how unusual it is, just in that way. It's also unusual in a whole series of other ways we can talk about it, but that in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the strength of the panel we've compiled with the two of you is the ability to kind of capture that comparative perspective. Annabelle, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I definitely agree with the three elements that Tom has identified. And I guess I would add a fourth one, which is the issue of gerrymandering, which is also a very distinct problem of the US electoral system, right? Even many other countries with single member districts do not have this problem. Gerrymandering is really the process by which representatives elect their voters rather than voters electing their representatives, right? And so it's an outrageous violation of democratic principles that representatives are redesigning their boundaries, the boundaries of their own districts. And so I think this compounds and reproduces the effect of primaries because the preferences of the more moderate majority are not represented in the selection of candidates because in the primaries, right, it's usually a highly ideological minority in the party that participates and shapes the selection of the candidates. And then the fact of gerrymandering also kind of conveys, kind of reproduces that into multiple rounds of the general election. And so I think this creates a further problem. I I think that I agree that in a way of all of these four problems that are all very relevant in terms of institutional design, the issue of primaries is kind of the starting point. And so you see many kind of people thinking about how to deal with this issue, right? How to give voters choice, but at the same time try to avoid the undue influence that extreme segments in each party have in primaries. So I think that many people now are proposing solutions like ranked choice voting, for example, right? Since we are talking about comparative perspectives, I really like the solution that Uruguayans have for this problem, that is what they call the double simultaneous vote, which essentially means that it's very efficient. You combine the primary and the general in a single election. So each party fields several candidates, right, depending on the number of factions that they have. Then people vote for one candidate, and the candidate within each party that has the most votes collects the votes for the whole party. So in that way, right, if moderate candidates are the most preferred by most of the public, then they have an advantage within the party, but the votes of the party are faithfully represented in the competition. And so I think clearly there are solutions to this, but that means that institutions need to be adjusted.
Right. And you have to find that kind of path to reform that is acceptable to, the people in it who were elected prior to the reform, right?
Right.
So that's always the trick. Um, in a moment here, we'll turn it over and start getting some questions from our audience, as I'm sure they'd like to participate as well. But just kind of building off of that last question and this importance of the way we choose our candidates, looking at the United States and the way it's institutionally set up at the moment and the way things, how influenced are politicians, do you feel, in the United States right now by the population at large? And how should we understand that relationship in terms of the impact on democracy? And so, like, if politicians are having a negative impact on democracy, is that because they're being influenced to do that by the population? Is it the other way around? How would you define that relationship and its importance for democracy in general? Thomas?
I was afraid you were going to call on me first. That's a really hard question.
Sorry.
Um, Look, it's I would start by challenging us to pay attention to the fact that politicians are shaping how the public thinks in many ways. Because once you have high levels of polarization, you begin to have the kind of tribal effect in politics where people sign on to they feel like they're part of a tribe. They feel like our people are this, the other people are that. And the leader of the tribe kind of defines what the tribe believes. And once you're into, I didn't use tribal as a slight on Africans. The way Americans are practicing tribal politics is not a compliment to anybody. It's America's own approach to tribalism. But I would say that the way tribalism is working in American politics is at least, I think Donald Trump obviously embodies some of this when he says, somebody will say that's not MAGA. And he says, look, I am MAGA. What I say goes. If, regime change in Iran is a priority for me, what I said about regime change a while back doesn't apply anymore. I am MAGA and I will shape those views. I think a lot of people will remember in 2015 when Donald Trump began emerging as a presidential political candidate, and that he began attacking immigrants in the country. And I remember thinking, that's not going to work. Americans are beyond that. We're an immigrant society. Look at the public opinion polls. Most Americans support a reasonable amount of immigration. Yeah, they're not unhappy. They're not happy about the high levels of illegal immigrants to this country. But they're basically, we're this. But he shaped that view over and over again through very persistent messaging that struck me at the time as kind of out there, but is now the mainstream where the majority of his supporters like the fact that he hasn't just taken that messaging and gotten elected with it. He's carried it out. Mass deportations, deportation centers around the countries. No kidding. Turns out you can shape public opinion to a remarkable degree. And so, yes, we can say politicians arise out of the foggy firmament of the society. Yeah, and they capture latent moods and ideas and they embody them and channel them, but sometimes they drive them. And I think we should start with that rather than just sort of assuming that all these politicians are just figments of the societal imagination in a way. We're underestimating the power of effective narrative, the narrative power of shrewd, determined, in many ways talented leaders.
Annabelle, would you say that's the case?
Yes, I certainly think that politicians create narratives that shape the agenda, right? We intuitively, I think we know that politicians do both. They influence their voters, they guide their voters, that's why they are leaders, right? And they are influenced by their voters too, in the sense that they have limits to sometimes what they can say. So they shape the public agenda and the options for voters and the tone of the conversation, as Tom was pointing out. But also many times they understand that their voters have limits and will not follow them on certain issues, right? And even Donald Trump who has an incredible capacity, as Tom pointed out, to drive his voters, sometimes encounters those limits. And I would say that typical politicians, most politicians are not very brave, right? There are some issues that they know they are problematic and they will not touch in their districts. But in addition to that, I think that today we have a new problem, which is that campaigning in social media rewards politicians who take extreme positions, right? Because we have so much information all the time. We are receiving so much information through our phones that moderate voices really get lost in the flow of information, the flow of memes. And so unless you take an outrageous position, it's hard for people to remember you, either because they really dislike you or because they feel that you are saying something that they wanted to say and they were not allowed to. And so, in a way, communications technology is rewarding bad behavior and pushing public discourse into more extreme positions and more anti-democratic directions. And so I think that compounds the problem.
It's an interesting point you raise, and I think that's something I've seen more and more of lately, right? Is that this new, social media communication dynamic that is obviously something new to the last 20 years or so is really changing, right? That relationship. And so it's probably, like Thomas alluded to, quite hard to distill already the lessons of what is the importance of this relationship on democracy when we're still kind of figuring out how that works. So I'd like to turn it over now to our audience and let them ask our panelists some questions. And we have a question here that I'll read for you, and you can decide which one of you would like to answer it for first. They asked, does the decline of more organic societal tribes like churches, social clubs, civil society, etc., make society more susceptible to political messages that offer people a tribe? And so, kind of as we see those more traditional or more organic things disappear into the background, or they kind of melt away or have less importance, does a political tribe become more appealing to people? Does that become more of an avenue for politicians to exploit?
I think that's a good insight. Yes, I think it does. I think in the United States, the hollowing out of many social institutions over the last 30 or 40 years, for a whole series of reasons, one can put the blame or credit on that on many things, is very damaging because many of those institutions were quite cross-cutting in different ways, whether it was, Rotary clubs and Elks clubs or bridge clubs or church groups of this type or other kinds of religious organizations, and a whole series of, the bowling alone kind of argument. Many of them were politically cross-cutting, and they were creating bonds within communities and within states that were very important in lessening the importance of that. I remember, I was watching a number of years back, watching Mad Men, like probably some people here in this event, and there's a scene it's around the time Nixon's and Kennedy are at a contest together, 1960, and they're sitting there socially in something, and one of them kind of says, like, never occurred to me, I wonder who he's voting for. They're thinking about somebody. They don't really have any idea, because it was like not clear. You could be a moderate Republican or a moderate Democrat and sit side by side for years and probably not have very little sense of who the other person might be voting for. Whereas now you would know, if you work closely with somebody, or live next door to somebody in a sustained way and get to know them, you're going to know, because it's somehow it's the only thing by which people are now feeling some attachment. And so you take away the other attachments, people have this restless search for a sense of belonging, this alienation people feel in many ways, the individualization of life that is occurring for so many reasons, technology keeping us, isolated from each other, and many businesses pushing decisions down to the individual level. So you feel like it's all up to me to decide, which phone plan might be best. I can't trust anybody. I have to do hours of research to choose which phone plan. And individuals are living in these intensely individualized worlds, and they don't feel much belonging to many social institutions. And so you do want to feel part of something. And political tribes are a way of, giving you some sense of belonging and meaning in that larger way. So I do think things are intimately connected.
Thank you. Annabelle?
I agree. I would also point out that it seems to me that in maybe over the past 3 or 4 decades, those organic societal tribes or social groups or forms of social organization, to the extent that they exist, and I think they still play important roles in many places, particularly in rural areas, but they have become less diverse than they used to be. And so now they tend to be more, I think they tend to be more ideologically cohesive in their points of view, and so sometimes they reproduce rather than moderate the political perspectives in some cases.
Interesting. I know, Annabelle, you had already spoken about, kind of the Uruguayan solution that you thought. We had a question to ask both of you what you thought of increasing the size of the House of Representatives in terms of being a solution and how that might affect the behavior of political actors. Do either of you would like to take that
Well,
one?
my instinct, I don't mean to step in front of you, but my instinct on that would be I wish we could reduce gerrymandering rather than going after the size of the house. Because if we have a larger house but still a lot of gerrymandering, I feel like we're not getting to the problem. Because even if you have a smaller district, you feel like, okay, more likely to feel some sense of connection to my representative or to the community that votes for them. If it's turned into a safe seat, if we have 90% plus safe seats in the House, what's that connection really going to mean? Because it's still going to be kind of a given which way this district goes, and I'm going to feel disempowered to compete or disempowered to engage very much. So I think the idea of increasing the House is a workaround the gerrymandering problem to some extent. That I don't think would necessarily get at what's the essential problem of feeling not very represented by their politicians in many cases. But that's just off the top of my head.
Do you have a solution you would prefer in terms of solving the gerrymandering question?
Well, look, we thought we were making some progress over the last 10 years on gerrymandering, but that hasn't been happening in the last year. It's a race to the bottom on gerrymandering. Both sides are guilty of it in different ways. One can get into lots of arguments about who more and why and so forth, but we're headed in a bad direction. It's just another example of where the centrifugal tendencies of polarization lock you into behaviors that deep down you know are not good for democracy, but you want to protect your tribe, so you do it. And unfortunately, that's where we are.
Annabelle?
Yes, I'm not completely sure what's the theory of change, so to speak, that Benjamin has in mind. But so one potential reason to increase the size of the house, as Tom was pointing out, is with the expectation that you have more representatives, they are closer to their constituencies, right? And so you have better representation. But as Tom was pointing out, if you have gerrymandering, then again, it's the representatives electing their voters, so we don't get much of that. The other reason usually to expand the size of a house is to get greater proportionality, right? So you have more seats, you can generate more proportional results. But in the US case, again, if you have gerrymandering and with single member districts, you wouldn't get any of that. So I tend to agree in the sense that the key issue would be to fix the current problems of the electoral system before we modify the size of the house.
That makes sense. We had another question. Can you speak to the correlation between democratic backsliding in America and the erosion of the separation of powers? Once, when asked how many presidents he had served under, then Senator Byrd bristled and replied that he had served. It looks like the question cut off, but either way, what is that correlation between democratic backsliding in America and the erosion of the separation of powers in your opinion? Anibal, did you want to take that first?
Sure. So I think that it's a crucial correlation, not only in America, but in every country in which we have seen the erosion of democracy, right? The separation of power, the erosion of separation of powers is a critical component because usually the erosion of democracy in most cases, in a vast majority of cases, means a concentration of power in the executive branch. And therefore, a legislature that is aligned with the executive without exercising any oversight, and eventually a judiciary that is captured by the executive. And so once you have that situation, it's very hard to contain the process of democratic backsliding unless society mobilizes. And so it's the problem that we have seen in cases like Hungary, Venezuela, right? All the classic cases of democratic erosion. So the issue of separation of powers is crucial. And in the US, of course, much of our concerns about the potential for democratic erosions have to do with the sense that Congress is less active than it used to be in terms of exercising oversight, and that the Supreme Court in recent years has become increasingly willing to be deferential to the executive branch. And so it seems to me that the issue of separation of powers is central.
I think something that comes up, and so our our attendee finished their question and said that Senator Byrd bristled and replied he had served alongside 11 presidents, but under none. And I think that that's important and goes back to what you're saying there, Anibal, in that Congress has been decidedly less active. And so, like, I think personally, when I look at the erosion of the separation of powers, I'm shocked by how much Congress is willing to be irrelevant, like how willing it is to not play a role as long as the president is who they agree with. And so like, yeah, I don't know if Thomas, in your answer, you can address, kind of that willingness of Congress to have its own power eroded.
Yeah, I think partly it's related, Jonathan, to polarization in the sense that in the last couple of years, I had $1 for every time I was in a conversation where somebody who's not a fan of Donald Trump says to me, God, I can't believe those Republicans in the Senate that are going along with him. Why don't they stand up, at least for their own prerogatives and power as a Congress? I just don't get it. When is somebody going to stand up and say, that's not on? You can't dismantle this thing that was created by Congress without asking Congress's opinion. You can't break that norm that's fundamental to this or that. I don't get it. Why is Congress abandoning its role? Well, because the people who are abandoning that role in many cases, they believe in the larger vision that the president is trying to pursue, and they've signed on to that tribal vision of America. They want that one. They want that vision of America. No, they're not very happy about it, not having that power, this power, but they have a higher cause, which they believe is fundamental to saving the country. And so they've got to go with it because they sign on. They believe in 80 to 90% of what he's doing. And so they're not going to quibble about 10 or 20%. If they were to go against that, they're going against the whole tribe. They're going against the vision. Yes, he is also a fairly punitive guy and he's retributive and so forth, indeed. But more deeply, they're on that team. They have signed on to that team. They wear that color shirt. The other side wears a different color shirt. They're not going to take off their shirt and put on a different color shirt because that's their only choice. They're not going to go naked. They got to wear something. And the choice is only a red shirt or a blue shirt in their view. And so I get a little tired of people being so surprised that the members of that team turn out to be loyal to that team. Yep, they do. And I suspect if things were in a different direction and we had a Democratic president who was very norm breaking and so forth, a lot of people on the Democratic side of Congress would, well, I haven't read about that. I haven't heard about that. I'm not sure. That's not really my area. You'd hear a lot of the same stuff. I'm not saying it'll all be exactly the same, but that is a function of highly polarized politics in which people are willing to sacrifice certain basic norms for the sake of their competing vision.
So I think our next question actually builds quite nicely onto that because you're mentioning like this tribal, kind of the siege mentality that they both have, and you can't go outside of your bunker or your team. And so someone asked, kind of going back to our question about potential solutions, do countries, and both of you have a lot of international experience, that have a multiplicity of political parties do a better job of avoiding that type of tribal mentality and polarization? Or do they just kind of devolve into camps in the same way? Yeah, either one of you, whoever would like to take that first, please go ahead.
Anibal, why don't you dive in?
I think that's thanks, Tom. I think that's a beautiful question because if you had asked political scientists a few decades ago, I think the standard kind of conventional answer was no, two-party systems are very good because then you have competition that moves towards the center because they want to capture the majority of voters, so the two parties moderate, and kind of the two parties capture any extremists in society, but then they subsume them in this kind of very moderate kind of mass politics, and so you avoid extremists, right? Well, if you have multiple parties like a kind of European style. Then you have the communists and you have the extreme right, and those parties kind of are spoilers of the game, and they polarize politics, and then you can have a lot of instability. I think that was the conventional wisdom for many political scientists until a few decades ago. And now, of course, people think completely different in part because of the experience of the US. But again, I think the devil is in the details, right? This takes us back to the discussion about primaries before. If you have two parties and you let the most extreme segments of those parties to select the candidates in primaries, then by the time you get to the general election, those two parties are not moderate anymore because the voters who identify in a tribal way with either party, they are kind of forced to vote for extreme candidates, right? I think this idea of two parties that were very moderate and naturally inclined to be moderate catch-all parties came from an era in which conventions selected the candidates, and therefore professional politicians were trying to game who was the best candidate to win the general election. So I think it's actually in different systems it can work either way, but the devil is in the institutional details.
It's
Interesting.
certainly enjoyable as just kind of thought experiment, and when one's immersed in the frustrations of US politics, to imagine an America with a multi-party system and think right away one can easily imagine a four-party system. You'd have a hard right party, you'd have a moderate right business-oriented party, you'd have a moderate centrist left type party, professional class, technocratic, and so forth, and then a kind of hard left progressive type party. And then, as kind of German style, AfD, CDU, Social Democrats, and the Greens, a little bit like that. And you might have a grand coalition between the center left and center right parties and keeping the extremes out. But as Anibal says, it works different ways in different systems. Look at Israel, multi-party system, lots of parties. But there, because of the way the deadlock between the center left and what used to be the center right, it's now pretty hard right, and it's Netanyahu's folks, of the small religious parties, they play an outside role. And in a way, the extreme are the tail wagging the dog of Israeli politics in many cases, just because of the way electoral numbers and sort of work out in that system. You can have very small parties on either side play an outsized role. So as Anibal said, the devil's in the details, or depends on how a system is functioning.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that goes kind of back to our earlier conversation about the importance of how we're choosing the candidates and, what that means for the United States because of the way its primary system works right now and potential solutions there. Uh, Cognitive of the fact that our time is going to come up here in a moment, I wanted to give each of you a chance for a last word to kind of put out there a takeaway for our attendees today. Specifically, what is one major takeaway from your research, your experience for the current political moment in the United States, and where do we go from here? And so I'll let either one of you decide who wants. I know that's a very large and open-ended question, so I don't imagine that you have a perfect answer in mind, but something that you would like our attendees to take away today is, what comes out of your research for our moment now, and where do we go from here?
Spoiler alert, yeah, Jonathan gave us this question in advance because he didn't want us to embarrass ourselves if we couldn't think of anything important from our research. So he's saving us from embarrassment here. Anibal, I'll go ahead if you don't mind, and then you can go ahead. I'm not sure, it's not really a finding of mine, but it's something that doesn't get enough attention, I think. And I think it's a clarifying realization, although I'm not sure where it leads us, but which is the following. If you take the democracies in the world, the sort of quote wealthy established democracies that largely existed before 1989, Northern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Canada, North America, minus Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, so forth. If you take those countries, and there's quite a few of them, the United States is the only one of those countries that has experienced significant democratic backsliding in the last 10 or 20 years. Israel is the only other one, if you include it in that group. Israel is a bit of an exception in that group in various ways, that has experienced significant backsliding. In other words, we're in a moment in the United States where, again, at $1 for every article I read, sort of associating what's happening in the United States with lots of other countries, they blur over the fact that when they mention a bunch of other countries, they're outside that zone of countries. The United States is the only wealthy established democracy experiencing really fundamental democratic tremors, or whatever one wants to call what's happening in the United States. That should make us think, what are the distinctive elements of US society, US political system, and US political actors that are making that happen? Of course, there are tremors in Germany, and of course, Great Britain, politics is like that these days, and France is going this way and that way. But they have not experienced, look at the VDEM ratings if you want, or Freedom House. The United States is the only country that is having systematic corrosion of its institutions and norms in that set of countries. So I would just leave us with that thought and make us think, let's be careful not to think we're all in the boat together. No, we're kind of alone in this boat. What does that say about us?
Thank you. Well,
Well, I've always been concerned with the question of separation of powers that was raised before, right? And I feel that has always been central in the history of the US, and it's going to be crucial for redirecting the strength of US democracy. My sense is that soon we will get to a moment similar to the post-Watergate moment, and we'll need to figure out how to craft a series of bipartisan laws for the reconstruction of Republican life, right? And based on our conversation today, I think that there are probably three areas that are going to be crucial. One is elections, like a question of primaries, limiting gerrymandering, and so on. The second is the question of reestablishing constraints on the executive, right? On issues like war and military operations, on budget impoundment, on basic questions like pardons, right? I think that there needs to be a bipartisan agreement on that. And finally, there is the more complicated issue of communications, right? Social media need to be more accountable, but that's clearly a kind of worms that nobody really knows how to deal with. But I think that if there is not a bipartisan consensus to craft laws around these topics, eventually we will see politicians on either side outbidding each other in taking extreme positions. And this is going to be terrible for both parties and for American democracy.
thank you. I think those are both really quite salient messages, and it really highlights, especially when you discuss American democracy or the democracy in the United States, there's a lot of talk of American exceptionalism and, what makes the United States different. And here we're seeing, with democratic backsliding, there is also a degree of American exceptionalism, right? There are things that make the United States different, and it will have to be a truly US solution from where we go here that, as you say, Annabelle, needs to be bipartisan if it's to be legitimate. And so I thank both of you for those insights and for joining us today, because I think this has been a great panel and something that will give our attendees a lot to take away. And so, again, thank you for spending your time with us today. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining us as well. It has been a great event, and we will keep you informed for future events. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, bye-bye.